voting rights, it rejected parliamentary sovereignty, and it moved to a more quasi-federal system under a supreme constitution with extended franchise to all people. So that's the bottom line, which then I left you with this question, whether we have a complete constitutional break, or whether we have a continuation of the system that existed before. And this is part of the question that you had to answer in the exam, and I wanted you to consider whether it is possible to say, because I mean, obviously this speaks to the very legitimacy of the Constitution, whether this Constitution is of here or not of here. Because if we have, I usually say incorporated, but I mean imported lock, stock and barrel, something which is foreign to the people, foreign to the situation, and foreign to the needs of the people in society, is that truly a constitution that speaks to the needs, that speaks to the people, that we can accept as a legitimate reflection of the will of the people? And obviously that was foremost in the mind of the people who participated in this drafting process, because there was a two-stage approach, or a two-phased rather approach to the transition to constitutional democracy. And you will recall this, none of it's new. I think this was a question in your case, something like that, I can't even remember. But the reality is that what happened then was a negotiation between unelected political representatives. And those unelected political representatives, from that position of where they do not have a public mandate, said, I'm sorry, but we cannot here decide in Kempton Park from 1990 to 1993, we cannot make decisions for the people of South Africa. What we need to do is we can make broad stroke agreements to end apartheid, and then we can set out the blueprint for how governance will take place in future. So the important thing to bear in mind here is that the legitimacy was derived from the election of the 27th of April 1994. Because that legitimacy established the Constitutional Assembly, and the Constitutional Assembly went on to draft the Constitution in accordance with the constitutional principles that were agreed upon. So who can tell me what the certification process was? Who carried the certification process out? All together now? The Constitutional Court. What did it entail? Your recent constitutional history, and I mean, I know you don't think it's recent, but it is recent. So from 1990 onwards, it's actually quite important to understand the context. And as I said yesterday, in particular at this point in time, where people are increasingly questioning the decisions of the early 1990s, we have to understand where they come from. We can't say they're good or they're bad without knowing where they come from. So we have to go back to that constitutional history. The certification process required the court, and this was part of the agreement to end apartheid. The certification process required the newly established Constitutional Court. And the people who served as judges in the first Constitutional Court were people who specifically were chosen for their expertise and their non-alignment politically. So they participated in this process of looking at the principles, and those principles said we have to have separation of powers, we have to have a Bill of Rights, we have to have some sort of federal division or a quasi-federal system of acknowledging government at different levels, and a whole host of other things in the 34 constitutional principles. And that was then agreed upon and set out in the text of the Constitution, the 96 Constitution, which was then submitted to the court for consideration. So the court looked at the 34 principles, the court looked at the new text, and the court listened to arguments. Because obviously there were a variety of people who said, this is acceptable, this is not acceptable, this goes too far, this doesn't go too far, or as far as it should go. And therefore, the court considered whether there's compliance with the text, or the principles rather, whether there's compliance of the text with the principles set out in Schedule 4 of the interim constitution. And the court then considered that it was, in the first instance, not compliant, it was revised, the second certification judgment certified it as compliant, and then it was signed into law and came into operation in February 1997. As I said yesterday, it's important that the Bill of Rights be considered in context and that it is part of the Supreme Constitution. Why is it important that it is part of the Supreme Constitution rather than just an act of Parliament? What would be the effect if it is simply an act of Parliament? It could be easily amended. Because it is part of the Constitution, it is entrenched. What do we mean when we say that legislation or a legislative provision is entrenched? You can't change it easily. It means that there are processes and procedures in place that we have to follow if we want to change the Constitution. But that is very important, that we have to bear in mind these things are not cast in stone. They can be amended. Because times change, the needs of societies change. But the Constitution has to be providing a fairly stable basis for governance, a fairly stable basis delineating what our entitlements are in respect of the state, in respect of one another, to provide that framework of governance, which is then filled in by legislation that can be amended. But obviously, the legislation must comply with that constitutional standard. Okay, but it may be amended, and this is why we are engaging in this process of whether Section 25 is or is not desirable or does or does not serve the purposes of the South African society insofar as access to land is concerned. That's a debate for you for a different day, probably next year when we deal with the law of property. But the reality is what we have to look at is the Bill of Rights as an exercise of constraint, or as a measure of putting constraints in place on the exercise of governmental power. Because for the most part, we're going to focus on how it relates to relationships between the individual and the state. Okay, and then I want to talk about classification of human rights, and this is also nothing new. We've heard this 1,000 times. We're going to go through that, and then I want to start the discussion on obligations that arise from the Bill of Rights. So traditionally, human rights are seen as shields. So this is my bubble, this is my shield. I'll hold it here. I say with this bubble, with this right that is given to me in terms of the Constitution, don't tell me what I can say and what I can't say. Don't tell me where I can live and where I can't live. I can do this because of the entitlement created in terms of this right that is set out in the Constitution for me. So you have a protection in the form of a barrier that protects you from infringement on that particular right. Now, when human rights were first formed or first conceptualized, that was very important because we had the king, or typically the king, in a monarchy, and that person would make the law, execute the law, implement the law, to make the judicial decisions, and it leaves the individual very vulnerable in relation to that powerful monarch. So the idea is to create a legal entitlement, a legal barrier to protect the individual. When that moved from being an individual to institutions, to protect the individual from the institutions. So that the institutions can't simply walk in and say, okay, we're taking your property, you can't stay here anymore, you're not allowed to have children, you're not allowed to do this, you can't believe that, you have to only believe this, and so forth. So it creates a barrier of protection. And those rights that are traditionally seen as the shields were the rights that were conceptualized in the wake of the French Revolution, or prior to the French Revolution, that people have certain inalienable, and what do we mean by that? I cannot get rid of it. I can't say I'm not interested in my human rights. I've got them. Immutable human rights, which must be protected and upheld against government, because government is more powerful than the individual. And these are, for example, as I said, your shield rights are freedom of expression, freedom of unreasonable search and seizure, property rights, and the right to a fair trial. So these are rights that are mine, and they create a barrier or a shield. Shield is probably the best way to think of them in a sort of very literal fashion. Because they say, government, you can regulate my movement, you can regulate my speech, but only to a certain extent. You can't tell me what I have to think. You can't tell me where I have to stay. You can't tell me what I have to believe. Because those are my fundamental rights that are inalienable and protected under the Constitution. But what is very important and noteworthy about these rights is that they are mine. They are strongly individualistic. They pertain to the individual. They do not belong to a group of people. A group of people together can exercise freedom of expression. However, it still pertains to the individual to have that freedom of expression. Now, what is also important to bear in mind, and the shield actually helps in this, thinking about it in this way, is you use it to push away. It's a negative protection. So it places an obligation on the state not to infringe. So the obligation is a negative obligation. Do not interfere with my freedom of expression. Do not take my property. Do not rig a trial so that I don't have a fair trial. So they are strongly individualistic and they are negatively protected. And these rights go back to the time of the French Revolution, before the French Revolution, and the philosophers wrote about this. And therefore, Johann Galtung, and I ask you to please go and read Galtung, because Galtung actually was a visionary, or is, well, I don't know whether he's still alive. Last year he was still alive. But he really thought very carefully about the fact that these things aren't static. In a couple of years' time, we will be thinking differently about human rights. We will be thinking about, are those rights only for human beings? Are they for artificial human beings? Are they for animals? We are thinking already, there are people already agitating, sentient beings have certain rights. And if Coco, the chimpanzee who died last week, silent to her, you could sign 1,000 words in sign language. Coco obviously couldn't vote, but Coco clearly was a sentient being with thoughts and ideas. She wanted a kitten in 1989. And they got it. Isn't that cute? Okay, that's probably why I did. But okay, now, first generation human rights, he calls them blue rights. Why does he call them blue rights? Because the color of the bourgeois, as they were rising up against the French king and the monarch, is blue. So that is the right, the color that is attached to it. And Galtung uses colors to try and get away from the idea of a hierarchy. He says if we have a rainbow of rights, we don't think of the top of the rainbow as more important as the bottom of the rainbow. We think of the rainbow as beautiful and complementary and hangs together. We don't think of that one is more important than this one. Whereas if we call rights first, second, and third, we think gold, silver, and bronze. So those are not that important. These are very important, but those are not that important. But as we go on through the discussion, and this is also something I know you've heard 1,000 times, through history, the debate shifted. And the debate will shift again. Because people realize, particularly after the Second World War and the atrocities of the Second World War, well, fair enough, we have, in a variety of documents and in a variety of Bill of Rights and constitutions, we have protected these freedom of speech rights, we've protected property rights, we've protected all these first-generation human rights. But actually, what does your right to vote mean if you do not have the means to exercise that right? So that the understanding became more and more that one's socio-economic well-being is incredibly important when it comes to the understanding of how one exercises your agency and how one exercises your rights in society. So in other words, this is what I mean by that. You have to eat every day. You have to have a place where you sleep every night. But you only vote once every 5 years. You have to be able to make sense of policies of political parties. You need to be educated. You need to be able to read and listen and understand and make an informed choice in order to be a responsible citizen exercising your voting rights. If you don't, well, that right that you have to vote means nothing. Or not nothing. It's a bad person you can talk about quality of life in which your socio-economic needs are addressed. Now, that is not a needle, it is a sword. It was very small and I tried to make it big. So, a sword meaning you take this right in your hand and you say to the state, what are you doing to provide access to education? What are you doing to provide access to housing? Can you see how this is different and how the obligation that is placed on the state is different than the obligation don't? The don't obligation tells the state to stay away. The positive obligation gives you an entitlement and you say, well, actually, what are you doing about this? People need water. What are you doing to ensure that people have access to clean drink and safe drinking water? What are you doing about that? What are you doing about textbooks in schools? What are you doing about healthcare services? You need to do something. Now, the challenge is, obviously, that it costs money. And it's very difficult to realize these rights without a structured plan. Because it is not as if these rights weren't protected in the interim constitution. So the interim constitution was drafted in roughly about the end of 92, 93, came into operation, and then we had the Constitution 96. But for many people in South Africa, what has changed? For some of them, they have access to housing now, they have electricity, they have running water. However, for many people, it took many, many years. Because it was not possible to just say, as by magic now, there is access to housing, as if by magic there's access to schooling, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. So these are programmatic in nature, and they require resources. So what does that tell us about the role of the judiciary? How does the judiciary feel about finishing budgets? They don't like that. So when it comes to the enforcement, judicial enforcement of socio-economic rights, that poses a challenge. Because if I go to court and I say, I'm a child, I have Section 29 rights in terms of access to education, the Eastern Cape government did not deliver on it, I go to the High Court here in Graveston and I say, I insist on my right to education to be fulfilled in accordance with the policies and legislative framework set out. If a court says, Eastern Cape Department of Basic Education, you have an obligation, that necessarily has financial implications. But obviously, the separation of powers argument is not circumvented, but it is addressed through the fact that if governments made a plan to roll out access to education, it is within the authority of the court to say, give to your own plan. But we'll talk about socio-economic rights in more detail. But the important thing that we have to bear in mind is that they require resources. Galton calls these rights red rights. And once again, he calls them red because he doesn't want to call them second generation rights. Because second is like the silver medal, it's not the gold. It's important, but it's not that important. So he says, let's get away from this idea of second generation. Let's acknowledge the roots of these rights are in the workers' movement. Because particularly after the Second World War, the workers' movement agitated quite strongly to say that it's not good enough for government to just say, okay, you can say what you want to say, you can live where you want to live. There's an obligation, if we pay taxes, there's an obligation on government to deliver. Some of the things that it has to deliver, access to healthcare, access to social security, and so forth. Grootboom, you've read? Leo 31? No? Okay, you will meet Mrs. Grootboom. She is no longer with us. But we will talk about her case, which is really a very important case in the development of our socio-economic rights litigation or jurisprudence in South Africa. But it shows us, whereas these rights are powerful and they create entitlements to positive action on the part of the state, it's not the panacea. It's not going to solve all our problems. We can go to court, we can litigate, but Mrs. Grootboom died in exactly the same situation that she was in prior to her starting the litigation. 8 years after the war. 8 years is a little bit of time. And then sort of around about the 1970s, 80s, there was a development of the acknowledgement of the importance of group affiliations, and then also the importance of maintaining our environment and keeping it for future generations. And that then led to what Galtung calls green rights. And these green rights are grassroots level. That's why he calls them green, because they are at the grassroots level, where people recognize the importance of group affiliation. So the right of communities, cultural communities, language communities, religious communities, to together exercise their rights, the right to development, the right to a clean environment, and this, like the second generation right, it puts a positive obligation, because the environment's not going to clean itself. There has to be a legislative framework that says, if you spill oil into the ocean, there are consequences. If you mess in rivers with raw sewage, there are consequences. Whether you're a factory, whether you're a municipality, whatever the case may be, there must be something in place, something must be done. And that something that needs to be done necessarily places an obligation on the state. Because for the most part, who carries obligations in respect of human rights? That is the executive, the legislature, the elected branches, and then the judiciary will adjudicate if there are disputes in those instances. Okay, so that's the classification of rights, which is always very nice, because now we've classified the rights, but now we're going to say we don't like that classification. Isn't that fantastic? So, we're going to talk about slideshow from the beginning. So, we're going to look at the obligations imposed by the Bill of Rights. So we're starting where we ended. And that is with the classification of human rights. We said, isn't that nice? We can say that first generation human rights, or blue rights, they are strongly individualistic and they are negatively protected. Second generation rights, socioeconomic rights, red rights, are positively protected, and it places an obligation, sets an entitlement for the individual enforceable against the state. Similar with third generation human rights. So we have this classification. Why do we have this classification? And what are we going to do with it? So we're going to go back to the classification and we're going to add a comma button. And then we're going to look at what are the obligations that the Constitution places on the state in respect of human rights. And we specifically is going to stand for a significant period of time and look at section 7.2 of the Constitution. Now in your course outline you will see there's a reference to an article, an old one. It's an oldie but a goodie. What year is it? It doesn't even want to tell me what year it is. Your course outline under B, I would imagine it is. Page 6, 3. Highest Wishes, 1997, South African Journal of Human Rights. Now, you can read through the whole article, but for our current purposes, it is the first part of the article that is really important. But I will highlight the important parts as we go through it. But please read it, because it explains why it is important to say, yes, we have the classification system. And why do we have a classification system? Why do you think we have a classification system? Because we are lazy. Human beings are essentially bone idle lazy. And if any of you is not lazy, well, I apologize to you. But we don't want to think too much about things. We want to say, all of the pink flowers are like that. All of the blue ones are like that. Children don't really know how to operate in society, so therefore we need specific protection of them. Taxpayers are dealt with in a particular way. Married people, unmarried people. employed people, unemployed people, because that's how we do it. We put things in boxes to try and understand the complex world that we live in. Now this complex world, and I see my colors don't really show up, but the blue one is first, second, third generation, right? So they have negative implications, don't interfere, and then you rely positively on the right to enforce the entitlement that you have against the state. So there are positive and negative obligations flowing from these rights. And as a general rule, we will say negative, positive, positive. Isn't that what we're going to say? That's sort of the gut. But, as we said earlier on, we vote once every 5 years and we eat every day. Now, the Bill of Rights and the court, following international human rights law, says that the rights are indivisible and interdependent. So we use the classification and we have to acknowledge that as a conceptual tool only. It is only to help us over this little bit of laziness that we have in us. So let's just be a little bit lazy. We have this general idea, voting rights. Well, they don't have to do something, they just have to allow us to vote. But can you see that that's a flawed reasoning? Because how does an election take place? Someone has to do something, isn't it? You know, they have to have a voter's roll. There must be voting stations. There must be people working in those voting stations. Can you see that there's a positive aspect to it? Something must be done to realize the right. Whereas generally we would think, okay, the voting right simply means, leave me, if I want to vote for the Keep It Straight and Simple party, let me vote for the bloody Keep It Straight and Simple party. And if I don't want to vote, don't make me vote. Okay? That is our general impression of a first generation right. Just hands off. Whereas it is patently obvious, particularly with such an important right such as voting, something must be done to realize the right. So what do we get from that? There are negative obligations. Don't tell me who I can vote for. Let me vote. And then there are positive obligations. Make it possible for me to vote. So the rights are interdependent and interrelated, and all rights have positive and negative obligations. Okay, so now we've looked at the first generation right, we've looked at the right to vote. And we said, well, clearly we can see the negative part of it. But there's a positive part to it as well, a positive obligation on the state. Make it possible for me to vote. We must have ID cards. We must be able to go to a voting station. There must be ballot papers. Can you see that it's a massive operation? Now, in relation to access to housing, what do you think is the negative obligation in relation to access to housing? If you have a house and you have access to shelter, don't just arbitrarily get rid of the person. So if I am living in a place where I have access to shelter, I can only be deprived of that right with a court order. That's section 26.3. So the important thing that we have to bear in mind is even that right that we, in our heads, think of, I have the right, I have the legislation that gives effect to the right, I rely upon that to get the positive benefit thereof. It also is negatively protected. And the negative protection is in that where someone has access to shelter, they may not arbitrarily be deprived of that. And that is why we have eviction laws. That is why it is only possible to get rid of someone who is illegally occupying property through a court order. I can't just rock up there and get rid of the person. The right is negatively protected in the sense that where there are existing rights, I can only limit those rights in accordance with the law. Okay, so all the rights serve the goal of furthering and enhancing the human dignity of persons. And the rights are not like babysitters, but the rights acknowledge our agency. The rights acknowledge that we can lot in life. That is what the Bill of Rights acknowledges. But it also acknowledges that in some instances we are vulnerable and we need assistance. And therefore there is this entitlement either to hands-off and positive action on the part of the state. Okay. Let's then turn to section 7.2 of the Constitution. Section 7.2 contains the express obligations clause in terms of the Constitution. It says the state must respect, protect, promote, and fulfill all the rights in the Bill of Rights. It must respect, protect, promote, and fulfill all the rights in the Bill of Rights. So what can we see here? We can see that there are textual formulations of particular rights from section 9 onwards, but we also see that that is preceded by an acknowledgement of an obligation to respect, and respect is, I acknowledge you can do that. It's a little bit of a negative obligation to not undermine. Okay? Protect. Make it possible for me to exercise my right. Promote and fulfill. Do something. Don't just sit back and say, oh, yes, we realize you have the right to clean water, social services, social security. But do something to realize the rights. And what is important for our purposes is to remember that those three obligations, respect, protect, promote, and fulfill, exist in respect of all the rights in the Bill of Rights. So whether we are talking about the right to vote, section 19, whether we are talking about the right to equality, whether we are talking about section 12, whether we're talking about section 16, freedom of expression, in respect of all of those rights, there's an obligation to respect, protect, promote, and fulfill. Okay, does that make sense? But let's then look at what each of these mean. But it's important that we bear in mind, when we talk about respecting the right to freedom of expression, respecting or protecting or promoting the right to freedom of expression, we have to not only look at respect, protect, promote, fulfill, but we also have to look at the textual formulation. Because the textual formulation of section 16 will mean that the promotion and the fulfillment of the right to freedom of expression will mean something different than the promotion and fulfillment of the right of access to housing, section 26. So when we try to make sense of how these things hang together, we have to look at the general obligation and read that general obligation in relation to the specific obligation that is set out in the constitutional right that we are talking about. Because respect for the right to vote and promotion and protection of the right to vote mean different things. In comparison to freedom of movement, in comparison to right to a fair trial, and so forth and so forth. But okay, let's look in general. What does it mean if we talk about the primary obligation? And this idea of this being the primary obligation comes from De Force's article. He calls respect the primary obligation. And this primary obligation is essentially a negative obligation. So what does that mean? It means that in order to respect rights, what must the state do? State institutions should refrain from infringing. They should refrain from infringing directly on existing rights. So where someone has a legal entitlement that is protected, the state should not do something that undermines that entitlement. So this is a negative protection. So in order to respect a right, there is a general obligation on the state to respect all rights, whether we are talking about a traditional first-generation right or whether we are talking about a traditional third or first-generation right. There's that general obligation to say, okay, you have access to housing. I'm not going to undermine this right without following the due process that is set out in law. So, very importantly, this goes back to this idea of the dignity of the individual. Because when the state respects our rights, it acknowledges that we are agents. We are not pawns on a chessboard that are moved this way and that way. We are able to make decisions for ourselves. And if my decision is that I'm expressing myself in this particular way, and it's within the framework of the law, that right must be respected. If my decision is that I want to live here, it's within the framework of the law, that right must be respected. Okay, because it acknowledges that people are in charge of their own lives. Not that people are cattle or stones or whatever that can be placed in one place and moved to another. Okay. So there's an obligation not to interfere in existing rights and to allow individuals to plan and live their lives as they choose. But if I plan and live my life in such a way that it infringes upon your rights, then the other obligation on the state kicks in, and that is the obligation to ensure respect. And we'll get to respect. But the important thing that we have to bear in mind at this particular point is that none of the rights are absolutely functional. So my right to life doesn't mean that everyone else has to die so that I can live. My right to dignity doesn't mean that you have to shut up and never speak your mind about how silly you think my shoes are, my lecturing, or whatever the case may be. It doesn't mean that I'm immune. It doesn't mean, similarly, your right to dignity, your right to freedom of expression, your right to plan and live your life is limited by that of your neighbor. Because obviously, if we all try to exercise our rights to the fullest, can you imagine the chaos that will ensue? Because I will just go down to the shop and load up because I've got the right to all these things. But I can't, because there are boundaries set by the rights of others. So our rights are sort of, where the rights sort of come together, we have to find a way of balancing the clash between my right and your right. Okay. The second obligation kicks in, and that is the obligation to protect. And this ties in with the obligation that rests on the state to protect citizens. So if my right to life is so incredibly important to me that I walk around with a gun all the time, and if I just see someone looking at me, I shoot them. Well, clearly, I'm infringing upon other people's rights. So there's an obligation on the state to ensure that there are frameworks in place, legal and policy frameworks in place, to manage the potential conflict of rights. So if I'm, for example, a tenant, and I live in a place, and I rent that property, I have the right to use that property in accordance with the agreement. But the owner of the property has different rights to the rights that I have. But the owner of the property can't just come into my house without prior agreement. So the state must provide for the framework. The Rental Housing Act, a variety of other common law measures are also in place to ensure the orderly functioning of society. So there's an obligation on the state to ensure that I respect your right and that you respect mine. And how do they do that? By creating legislative frameworks to ensure that we can organize our affairs. And if we have a dispute, there are mechanisms to resolve that dispute. Okay. So the respect part, the protect part means that there's an obligation on the state to create frameworks within which we can conduct our business, respect one another in an orderly fashion. Because I can respect your right to freedom of expression, I can respect your right to freedom of movement within the bounds that are created by the law for that. Because if I see my right to freedom of movement as just I go wherever I want to, obviously I'm going to infringe on someone else's rights. So there ensure that you are able to exercise your right. Whether your right is one of property and my right is one of freedom of movement, and they will clash at some point. But the law must provide for a framework of resolution of those conflicts. So what do we see here? We see that the protect obligation requires positive action. So the state can't just say, oh, okay, we all have these lovely rights. There you are. Take your rights, manage your affairs, sort yourselves out. They have to ensure that there are frameworks in place so that I have the ability to manage my affairs so that they don't clash with yours. And if they do clash and there's a dispute, we know there's the court. We can go to the court and resolve our dispute. Okay. Shall we have a quick look at... That was a little bit fast. That was too fast. But it does seem that we will be leaving you hanging, and then the whole weekend you will be wondering. Okay, I won't carry on with this, but what I want to remind you, tutorials start on Monday. Your tutorial assignment, your tutorial worksheet was posted on Are You Connected? It has to do with classification of rights and obligations. So this actually would have been helpful, but you don't want it, you don't get it. No, I'm just being facetious. But you can read it for yourself. It's not hard, but remember, handing it in gives you 0.5%. Not handing it in means that you don't get that